This is the Financially Simple Podcast, a show dedicated to destroying the complexities of money for today's small business owner. And now, here's your host, pizza-loving, certified financial planner, Justin Goodbread.
Welcome to Financially Simple. This is a finance show for small business owners about money, how it works in our business and our personal lives, and ultimately how we can build wealth to be financially independent. I'm your host, Justin Goodbread, and today is episode number 22. Today's episode is titled The M&A Advisor, Investment Banker, or Business Broker. So in our last episode, episode 21, I spent some time talking about the football team, if you will. And on the football team, you're going to have your starting players. And we identified those starting players as your certified financial planner, your certified public accountant, and your attorney, your legal team. And those, for the most part, are going to be the core players you're going to have throughout the entire process. However, as we mentioned, you're also going to have special teams. You're going to have players which come into the game, so to speak, at key times, which act as facilitators for particular events. And some of these players play a vital role. Today's episode is talking about one of these type of players. Now, there are three different players which act in the same capacity. So the M&A advisors, or the mergers and acquisition advisor, the investment banker, or the business broker do roughly the same thing, but they all have different markets and they have different niches and different skill sets. So it's fair to say they act about the same, but they're really not. They're entirely different people. So ultimately, what type of player you use is dependent on the type of business, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to get to that. If I have an M&A advisor listening to this, and we've got some that we're going to interview on the podcast later on, they're going to say, dude, I am not like a business broker. I've got business brokers I already have lined up to bring onto the podcast, and they're going to say, man, Justin, I am not like an investment banker. We have totally different backgrounds. And that is true. All three of these players, the M&A advisor, the investment banker, and the business broker, they all have different strengths and weaknesses, and they're used at particular times. So let's identify the players. Let's look at their skill sets, and that should help us to decide which one of these players we need as part of our team. So now we're at the point where we want to sell the business. We built our core team, and now it's time immediately to bring in this expert, this one player. So let's look at the business broker, the M&A advisors, and then let's look at the investment banker, and let's see the advantages or disadvantages, and ultimately you're going to be able to decide what player you'll need for your particular business. So let's first look at the business broker. The business broker's primary role is to act as a facilitator, if you will, almost like a mediator, but more of a facilitator between buyers and sellers. The business broker will primarily serve smaller companies, which will probably sell more than likely to an individual buyer, versus large companies which sell to corporate buyers, right? So a business broker is typically working with, as I call it, mom and pops. And according to the Exit Planning Institute, EPI, there are some 5 million businesses which work in the capacity where a business broker is going to be. And they'll be like small service business, like a franchise, or like gas stations, or restaurants. These are the type of companies which typically fall into the business broker's purview. So the business broker will typically work with companies who sell less than $5 million, or the price tag is less than $5 million. And they'll typically have less than $1 million of EBITDA, or earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So the business broker is working with your smaller companies. Now, business brokers typically do not charge an upfront fee. Sometimes they do. If you've got a mess, and I dealt with some businesses that wanted to sell, and the business broker is like, man, I'm going to charge an upfront fee to get this thing positioned right. They've got a mess on their hand. But most of the time they don't. Rather, they'll charge a commission at the time the business sells. Okay? Whenever the business transaction is done, that's whenever the business broker will be paid. The business broker will typically ask for a lot of materials, and it's up to the seller, the actual individual seller, to provide the materials. And they could be marketing materials, financials, forecast. I know in the dental field, they'll ask for patient mixes. Same in the optometrist field. I had a veterinarian we were looking at on transition. We want to know how many dogs, how many cats, what type of procedures does that see in that marketplace. So the business broker is asking for a lot of information about the business, and it's typically left for the seller to provide. They don't typically typically require GAAP or GAAP accounted statements. And so because it's a little bit looser information providing, typically the sales price isn't going to be as high either. Now, the process the business broker walks through is similar to that of a piece of real estate being sold. So if you put a house on the market, your real estate agent will take pictures of the house. They'll come up with a marketing strategy to hit the demographic that wants to buy in that location. They'll arrange open houses. They'll meet with buyer's agents. They'll work through the whole process, answer questions, help facilitate changes. Whenever there's a home inspection, there's a problem made, the real estate agent will help you fix the problem or find somebody who can help you fix it, trying to ultimately get you to the point to where you close or sell the house. That's pretty similar to how a business broker works. They're going to go through and do the same thing. They're going to put lipstick on the business. They're going to make it look pretty for a buyer to come in and buy it. They'll answer questions for the buyer. A lot of times buyers don't have agents like they do in real estate, so the broker will act as an intermediary. One of the key functions that a business broker does is it acts as a cushion, if you will, between the buyer and the seller, and they're able to negotiate the details of a deal without a lot of emotion, if you will. Think about it. I mean, for small business owners, they put their lifeblood into this business, and all of a sudden some hotshot comes around just because they have money, they're going to tell you what's wrong with your business. I mean, tempers can flare pretty easy. Well, that's where the business broker comes in. They can kind of dampen those tempers. Now, the business itself could be one of the largest assets that a business owner has, so there's even more emotions. But an experienced business broker knows how to price the business, knows how to toot the business owner's horn, and do in such a way that it doesn't offend the seller. But then when the seller comes in and says, hey, I've got some problems, the business broker is typically crafty enough in their words, know how to handle the temperament of the business owners to help guide the business owner onto some issues that need to be resolved. So that's the idea behind a business broker. Think of it in a real estate agent. That gives you a really close idea. Now, the next player is an M&A advisor or a mergers and acquisitions advisor. So mergers and acquisition advisor bridges the transaction gap. Okay, so we're still dealing with a transaction. They deal with the gap between the small business, that one under $5 million in value, and the major large businesses, those typically over $100 million in sales price. So the M&A advisor is going to be working typically in that $30 million EBITDA range. Now, interestingly enough, the vast majority of transactions are under $30 million in range. The medium size of a private company exit is probably in the range of $12 to $15 million. And this information is provided to us by exits.com. They're the ones who've done the recent study on this. So they're showing that most mid-sized businesses are between $12 to $15 million in sales price. Now, larger transactions can become very complex. Okay, so we're not dealing with mom and pop businesses here. And so they become a little bit more complex, and now you're going to bring in regulatory bodies, various regulatory bodies like the Securities and Exchange Commission. However, depending on the transaction structure, many of the lower mid-market business advisors aren't required to be licensed. So just because you ask the M&A advisor, are you licensed? And they say, oh, no, I'm not, doesn't mean that they necessarily have to be. Now, there's a lot of gray area. Many of this is subject to interpretation. Hopefully soon with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and Congress will be able to make up for this. But carefully navigating this, the M&A advisors can give you good advice in this range of business. So they act similar to that of a business broker. But there are some differences. So what are the differences between an M&A advisor and a business broker? Well, as we talked about, business brokers often work with simple businesses, small mom and pop businesses, if you will. An M&A advisor is going to work with a more complex business transaction. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with. A business broker will often deal with an easy business that's easy to value, one that says, okay, it's worth $1 million, and they can easily define why that is. M&A advisors deal with typically businesses that are harder to evaluate. Business brokers may be limited to providing only a buyer-seller matching service. So like we talked about, they're listing the business for buyer and seller, and they're good at working through that. Whereas a lot of times M&A advisors will often offer that buying and selling matching service, but they also help arrange financing, provide outsourcing type structures. They'll help structure the actual transaction. They may have lawyers on their team. They may have accountants on the team. So they are a little bit more hands-on than just the business broker. Business brokers often operate in a very small region, a very small area, like a hometown or a state or a region of the country. Whereas M&A advisors work maybe on a national or even international scale sometimes, and they're bringing across complex mergers from multiple locations. So if you're a mom and pop and you have maybe 2 or 3 offices in an area. So I was thinking of one of our businesses that had in East Tennessee. It had an office in Chattanooga, which is about an hour and a half south of me. Had an office in Knoxville, which is where I'm currently located. And it had an office located in Johnson City, which is about an hour and a half north of us. So I had 3 different locations. Well, the business broker handled that just fine. It was all within the same domicile, all the same state laws. However, if we had offices located in maybe 7 different states, maybe you have community property states, maybe you have parishes like in Louisiana, the list could be enormous. Well, M&A advisors often work in that area. Both services have typically the same client profiles, but they're usually different. Business brokers work with smaller firms or individuals. Whereas your M&A advisors, they'll work with larger organizations. Maybe they're not selling a business to mom and pop. Maybe they're selling it to a company, or maybe they're selling it to an acquisition firm, maybe even the government, if you will. So there's a slight difference on who their target is. Now, business brokers work on sale as available, primarily targeting the commissions, right? So they get the job done and then they get paid. M&A advisors may work on a sale, but they also could charge fees. They can charge fees for helping figure out tax structures or legal services. But they also may have a combination of not only a commission and fees. Valuation methods are different. Business brokers use simple calculations. M&As often use a little bit more complex calculations. So there's a slight difference between M&A advisors and business brokers. Is one better than the other? Not at all. They both work in a very different marketplace.
You are listening to Financially Simple, destroying the complexities of money for today's small business owner.
Then out of left field, out of nowhere comes this investment banker. Oh, okay. So how are they different than the business broker and now the M&A advisor? Well, investment bankers typically work in the large business space. Typically, they're $100 million or greater. Now, I do know some investment bankers that will drop all the way down to the $50 million range in EBITDA, but many times their price point is much higher. Investment bankers provide services that brokers and M&As typically don't. And some of these services could be, like fairness options. They could be public offerings where they're taking a privately held company with Fred Flintstone and Wilma Ohm in the company. Now they're going to moving into now traded on the NASDAQ or traded in pink sheets or traded on the New York Stock Exchange. It's a much broader line of financial services that are offered by investment bankers. Typically, they're formally licensed as a broker-dealer, governed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Additionally, investment bankers have many people on staff, and the certifications could be wide viewed. They could have attorneys. In fact, many of them do have attorneys and CPAs. They may have license specifically geared to the sale and the transition of businesses. Investment bankers typically work in the most complex transactions that require very technical savvy services. They're working internationally. They work with big companies. Investment bankers are able to go into a boardroom with an army of attorneys and an army of CPAs and go through data points and explain the deal. So there are 3 different players. We're going to call these our special teams players. There's 3 different ones. But how do you know which one to select from? Well, there's 3 good ideas, if you will, on how to choose which player you may need. The first one is going to be size. How much or how big is the transaction? If you're selling a business and the price tag is under $5 million, chances are you're going to be looking for a business broker. Not always, but chances are. If you're in that price range of $5 to $30 million, then you're probably going to be working with a mergers and acquisition advisor. If you're over that 30 million, maybe a little more than that, depending on your particular circumstances, you may still be working with that M&A advisor, or now you may bring in an investment banker. If you're over $100 million in sales price, chances are you're working with an investment firm. You're working with an investment banker. So the price helps you decide on who you need on your team. The other thing that you're going to look at on how to decide who you need on the team is the buyer. Are you trying to sell it to an individual? Well, if you're trying to sell it to a mom and pop and they're not using corporate monies, then you're probably going to need a broker involved. However, if you're dealing with private monies, maybe it's some buying syndicate, maybe it's a hedge fund, maybe it's international buyers, then you're probably going to fall into that category of M&A advisors or investment bankers. So who's trying to buy it? If you're on that borderline area saying, Justin, man, I'm kind of in that price range of a broker. Yeah, I'm falling in that $5, $6, $7 million range, but I'm sure it's simple. You still may need to hire an M&A advisor firm over a broker or a broker of an M&A. So don't let the size of the business dictate that. The third point is brokers are good at handling very simple things. So it depends on how much help you need on the sale. If you don't need a lot of help, you've got a good accounting firm, you got a good legal firm, you may just need a broker. That may be all you need. However, if you're dealing with a little bit more complexity, dealing with multi-state laws, multi-country laws, if you're doing multi-country laws, you may deal with an investment banker. However, if you're in that area where you're saying, look, I'm trying to figure out how to get this thing to auction, trying to figure out how to make this thing work long term, then that's where a M&A advisor can come in and help you. So this group of people are vital for whenever we're getting ready to sell the business. They're going to walk us through the entire process. They're going to put lipstick on the pig, if you will. They're going to make our businesses look good, smell good. They're going to tell us what we need to do. They're going to help us keep our emotions tempered as we're dealing with buyers who want to tell us our pig is ugly. They're going to help us a lot. And just like that attorney, you want a good one here. You want a good group of people. Now, there's some tactics we can use on how to negotiate with these individuals, but I'm going to, at this point, lean on your lawyer on how to work with all that. But for the most part, you're going to have to hire one of these players. And this has just been a really simple overview to how these players work and who they are and how they operate. As you walk through this process and as you move into this process, your core group, your CFP, your CPA, and your attorney, those three individuals are going to be able to help you identify which player, which special teams player you need to bring in. But you will more than likely have one of these parties involved, more than likely. So, guys, I'm going to wrap it up right there, episode 22, on which special player do you need. We've talked about the business broker, we've talked about this mergers and acquisition advisor, and we've talked about this investment banker. All of them have their special skill set. All of them play in a different marketplace. Guys, as I always say, life is hard. Life is complicated. Life doesn't have to be. Let's continue to make our lives at least financially simple. Hey, y'all go out and create an awesome day.
You have been listening to the Financially Simple podcast. The information in this show is for informational purposes only. This show is not investment advice. Instead, seek help from a competent financial advisor. Justin Goodbread, CFP, is an investment advisor representative of Heritage Investors, a registered investment advisor.